Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me. This is Dan, and you're listening to the Having Initiative podcast. This episode is Political Alignment Part 2. Now, if you haven't listened to Part 1 yet, stop, go and do that, because I'm going to elaborate on things that were discussed there. And so in that, I talked about 4 basically axioms that can go on inside an individual that can affect their political leanings, or at least, I guess, likelihood of that. And so in this episode, I'm going to be talking about kind of real world situations about how these things are acted out and potential pitfalls about political bias. And again, these axioms weren't things that were taught. They're aspects of nature within an individual. So the chapters for this episode are how you look at something, your model is challenged, projection, tribalism, check yourself, and interacting with others. And so let's get started. So how you look at something. I don't know how you found this podcast, but odds are you've seen my logo, which as of recording this is a kind of teal cylinder floating in space. And in one direction, a shadow of a circle is cast, and in another, a shadow of a rectangle is cast. And there's a blue and black background and a kind of dividing the screen up into 3 parts. So that's my logo. I picked that for my podcast because it really struck me in terms of perception. So the item in the center is a cylinder, but on the right, it casts a circle shadow, and on the left, it casts a rectangle shadow. And so that's at least my interpretation, is that it illustrates the notion of how you look at something will affect what you see. And how observations can be accurate. It casts a circle shadow, it casts a rectangle shadow. Those can be accurate, but your conclusion can still be wrong. It's not a circle or a rectangle. It's a cylinder. And how more than one person looking at something from a different point of view, they will get different interpretations. But hey, that's just my interpretation of the symbol. Maybe it's something completely unrelated. So I mentioned how you look at something will affect how you see it. That was Dr. McGilchrist's notion. And so I mentioned politics, basically, how people look at the world will affect their political leanings. So here's an example. In part 1, I mentioned Dr. Jonathan Haidt and his 6 pillars of morality. And one of those pillars was the fairness model, the pillar. So with the results, both conservatives and liberals ranked fairly high in terms of fairness and as how much they found it important. They both believed it was pretty darn important. But how they viewed what was fair differed. And he quickly points out that conservatives, he illustrated with various interviews, and he showed slogans that for campaigns that showed basically their view of fairness is that you keep what you earn. And so apply that to tax policies and welfare. Now with liberals, with fairness, again, he showed interviews and basically campaign memorabilia about fairness, and it was more rooted in the notion that one person shouldn't have more than another, particularly if one of the people is suffering. So fairness was, everyone is quote unquote equal. Now, again, apply that to tax policy, and with both of them, apply that to, income earned or stock options. So, putting this into action about how you look at something will determine what you see. I saw an article from a liberal-leaning website that discovered a study that was basically in neuroscience, but was reporting what Dr. Haidt noticed about how liberals ranked high in the suffering aspect in terms of others, their attunement to the suffering of others. Now, again, this was a liberal website. The writer of the article expressed those scientific findings like this. It basically said, "This is why liberals are compassionate and care about everyone, and why conservatives kind of care about getting what they earned," that kind of thing. Or they're so caught up on that notion that it blocks them out to the suffering of others. It was basically phrased like Dr. Haidt's colleagues did. This is why conservatives are so dumb or selfish. So that's one example of how you look at something will affect what you see. Now, I saw another article on a conservative website, and it noted a study that, again, just like the previous one, as far as I can tell, it was done well, let's put it that way. The study indicated that liberals were diagnosed with mental illness at a substantially higher rate than conservatives. Again, this is the study in question. Now, the way that the writer posed it on this conservative-leaning website posed it as, "So this is why liberals are crazy. They have mental health issues far more than conservatives have. And that's why their policies are so out of touch with reality." So both of these examples, whoever's writing the article in a site with a staunch political leaning, they paint themselves in a good light and the other person in a negative light. That's how they chose to look at these things that affirmed their personal biases. And there's many more examples of people doing this. These two just were kind of close together, so it's a good example. And this is a very common occurrence. So, and I kind of exaggerated both because while they both took jabs at each other in these articles, there was a bit of quote unquote understanding expressed with them. But again, with that understanding, there was a lot of cynicism. And so that's what I meant. It illustrates what I mean about how people look down on others that disagree with them when their biases are confirmed with evidence. So your model is challenged. So I heard a story about a guy who studied karate, and he was very, very good at it. He quickly rose to the top of his dojo, I guess you could say, and he would compete in karate tournaments and win, do very good, and we would challenge a couple of people to little skirmishes or sparring and would come out on top. But one day he came in contact with a person who had studied a couple of things but excelled in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And so when they sparred, very quickly the Jiu-Jitsu guy would get him on the ground, and karate doesn't have great groundwork, or at least not compared to BJJ, and not in any of the branches I've seen. And so the karate guy, once he was on the floor, it was pretty much game over. And so he fought the Jiu-Jitsu guy once, lost. He's like, well, that was a fluke. And he tried again and again and again. And he kept getting steamrolled by this Jiu-Jitsu guy. And so the karate guy, I forget exactly how he handled it, but basically he was presented with the notion that karate didn't have all the answers, and that his previous successes with karate and winning, he just hadn't crossed the right person yet. And so I don't know if it was the person telling the story or if it was the guy himself said that, but it made him feel like his life up to that point when he fought the jiu-jitsu guy had been a lie. He had been wrong. And that was a bitter pill to swallow. And so that's what I mean by your model being challenged. It's difficult to, when you see evidence that you've been wrong this whole time, that's hard. And so this isn't so much this example right here. When people go to court and someone is accused of something very bad, if they've been in in prison for a while waiting trial, the lawyers will fight to make sure that they are not tried in court while they're wearing a jumpsuit. They want to get them in a suit. And there's a whole lot about image consulting. And the reason why is because a lot of people have, again, this is another axiom, the just world delusion, which is that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And so in terms of that's a model built into people. And so when they see a guy in a jumpsuit, a lot of people say, well, whether or not he did the crime he's here for, if he's in a jumpsuit, bad things happen to bad people. So something must have been wrong. And so that's something that defense attorneys very much have invested effort into combating with various means. And just getting them in a suit is one way of doing that. And so with both these stories, it's hard for people to go against their nature, go against that worldview that's informed by those deeper axioms, because a lot of the axioms aren't necessarily evidence-based. They're things that are built in. And so their nature can filter any proof that is presented to them. And that's kind of what was going on with the karate guy, is that he was steamrolled. Nope, let's try again. Nope, let's try again. Nope, let's try again. And I don't know if it was with that guy, but I've heard stories of with people who have had their styles that they've been training in their whole lives, utterly defeated. How it's like, well, they're in denial about it. Like, he just got lucky. Or in a real fight, we wouldn't do that. I've been holding back because this is sparring, that kind of thing. It filtered out any proof that was presented to them that they were lacking. And there's a willingness to believe or reject proof that's influenced by your nature. So evidence and proof in and of themselves, what they imply, those conclusions are also made by perception, even empirical ones. I think it's Friedrich Nietzsche who said, there are no facts, only interpretations. And so, yes, sometimes when someone is proving something, their proof can be wrong. And the only reason why they believed it was because it seemed to affirm what they believed. And so in the past few years, I've heard a lot about this term anti-bias training, and about how it says people are biased in a certain direction, and this training will make them unbiased. Some claim that, and others are saying, well, just maybe we'll combat those existing ones because those are a bigger issue. But I heard someone say being unbiased is just being biased in a different direction. And it's putting the notion that we all have something with us. And so training to be unbiased is often situated in combating one view. So if you truly go through with it, then you're just biasing yourself against one of your biases. But without any greater context, there's no reason to suggest that that's better than anything else. And so I've mentioned this before in the podcast. People have used the argument that you are biased and your views are inherited and you should question them. And there is truth in that, but the people pushing that idea oftentimes haven't done that to themselves. So again, that was kind of all over the place, but I hope that's illustrating that when our worldview is challenged, it can be difficult to accept truth that's presented to you, but at the same time, proof that's presented to you may not be as absolute as it's made out to be. So, a lot to go on there. So, next topic is projection. So, I'm going to talk about a couple of movies and TV shows and how people have gotten certain ideas from them that the creator maybe necessarily didn't intend. So, there's the 2012 film, The Dark Knight Rises. And in there, the villain, Bane, starts a revolution, and there's themes about class warfare and exploitation, that kind of thing. And that's something that he's kind of arguing, but it's unrelated to what his main goal was. He just wanted to destroy the entire city. and he causes a lot of misery by working up people to attack others, and the city goes to ruins, kind of. And then Batman, the hero, comes in and stops him. That's a very abbreviated version of the movie. But some people, with all of that, extrapolated some political ideas from it. And one was such that, again, Bane is the bad guy and Batman is the good guy. And so the bad guy basically was attacking wealthy people and creating an equal society where no one is above the law, and he caused a lot of misery, and Batman, the good guy, stopped him. And the parallel they made is that Bane's revolution reflects the attitudes of, I'll just be blunt, socialists who are calling for revolution, decrying wealth disparity and misery and like that, and about how we should all be equals. And basically all of that stuff created a hellish landscape where people were animals. And so they were arguing that the film was a argument against socialism and the revolution, a part of it. Now, to contrast that, the previous movie, 2008, The Dark Knight, I'm not going to go over the plot, but basically there was a technology that was developed that could basically hack into anyone's cell phone and listen to audio that was going on around them. And that was used to stop the villain, but it was very much outright stated in the movie that this is morally wrong and that we are doing it temporarily to stop a greater evil. And so people said that, again, I'll just be blunt here, that there was an anti-surveillance message with that, and it was very much critical of the Patriot Act that was signed into action by the Bush administration in response to 9/11, and they had a lot of criticism about that. And so with both these films, the director, Christopher Nolan, I believe he said that he was not advocating either of those social commentaries specifically. And like he said that, yes, there was a class warfare aspect to that, but the main point of The Dark Knight Rises was that he was pointing out the dangers of demagoguery and how Bane was riling up the emotions of people to get them to do things. And he wanted that charismatic, loud personalities could be dangerous. But people extrapolated the, criticism of a left-leaning ideal. And then with The Dark Knight, people interpreted that as being critical of the actions of a right-wing leaning president. So again, people saw these things, and were those things intentional? Well, according to Christopher Nolan, no, it wasn't about specific political commentary, but they perhaps projected their ideas onto what they saw. So another movie where this one's kind of funny because it wasn't that big of a deal, but the original Ghostbusters film, it's a funny comedy. I really like it. But people extrapolated that it was a Tea Party, a right-leaning party, propaganda. And they weren't so serious about this. It was kind of a joke. But they pointed out that throughout the film, basically, a couple of scientists are kicked out of a university. They open a private business. They're successful. They're solving a problem with society by doing their job and getting money for it. And then an EPA officer, the government essentially, sticks his hand in their affairs and causes the basically city to fall apart. Ghosts are released everywhere, and it's the end of the world. And again, it's whenever these private businessmen are allowed to do what they do best without restriction, that's when they save the city. And when they were at the university, they were getting paid to do nothing. And there literally is a line about how we don't have to produce anything, but now that we're fired from the university, we have to actually be productive. And so this was done as a joke, let's be honest. But they were saying that Ghostbusters was really Tea Party propaganda. The villain was the government, and the heroes were private business. And that one's not to be taken as seriously as the previous because they outright admitted this is a joke. And if you know the political leanings of the actors, I don't think that they would have gone along with that. So, another recent thing that came out on in America, at least, was the Squid Game TV show. Now, this one's a little different from the other examples because, the short version of it is that, spoilers, a bunch of people who are in debt are brought to this secret area where they're allowed to play games to get money, but all of these games are lethal, and some of them where they're just competing against like time or something. Other ones they are straight up competing against other people that you win, you live, you lose, you die, that kind of thing. And this one's different because the director straight out said that this was a critique of capitalism and about how it's exploiting people, making them desperate, because everyone who was involved in this game was desperate and in debt, and it's inhumane, that kind of thing, and it's getting people to just scrabble after money and stuff like that. However, other people saw it and said, well, this is actually a critique of communism and various things about how these people were being provided for and given a task, and they were forced to do everything, and that a lot of their actions that got them in this to begin with were their own fault and not something that was forced upon them, and that this benevolent group is forcing them to do what we want or you die, basically, and other things like that. And there are more extensive arguments with both of these. And it's fascinating to see, again, what is it really about? There's obviously the intention of the directors, but he's known for being an artist, and any art, regardless of what the intention of the person making it, there's this big gray area about interpretation. What is it really about? So that's a bit more on the head. And then I think I've mentioned this. Well, actually, I haven't, but there's a lot of TV that I used to watch, but it became very preachy and on the head in terms of politics. And an example was I used to like this TV show called Bones. And the gist of it is basically it's a crime scene investigation show, but the unique shtick is that the heroes are scientists at the Jeffersonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and so they're very scientifically leaning. And there's one guy who's an FBI agent who he's smart, but he's the dumb one of the group. Let's put it that way. But he's more people smart, whereas they're more book smart. And the formula for most episodes was that, someone discovers a dead body. The team is called in. They figure out what happens. And throughout the course of that, some interesting topic or facet of society is explored. And with the topics that are brought up, oftentimes there isn't a right or wrong answer at the end. It just, we explore these ideas, listen to both sides, and at the end it's like, well, it's complicated. We'll just have to do the best we can. And in the second season, there was an episode where the topic at hand for the episode was about the death penalty, the morality for and against it. And the cast was kind of 50-50 on the issue, and both sides presented interesting arguments. Like, I had my views, but the people that disagreed with me, they made a good case in some things, and it's not black and white. And so, again, it ended with the show didn't put one person right and another person wrong. It's like, yeah, this is complicated, but I think we can manage it if we are honest about it and discuss things. So that was in season 2. Fast forward to, I think, season 9, I saw an episode where, again, outside of the main detective mystery as to who murdered who, the topic of the death penalty came up. But in this time, one person had one view and everyone else had the opposite view. And with the show, they're scientists, so they often quote statistics and scientific facts, that kind of thing. It was so heavily stacked against that one person with that one view. And literally at the end of the episode, I kid you not, that one person was like, wow, I guess I never really thought about it. Maybe I was wrong. And it was painful to watch because every episode was basically pushing some idea and pushing one, this is right and everyone else is wrong who disagrees with that. And there were times where I agreed with the idea they were pushing, but I knew it wasn't that simple. I knew that, quote unquote, the other side had legitimate concerns, and we can't ignore them because those things are part of reality. And especially from a moral sense, we can't just blind ourselves to that. And I could go into other TV shows, but bottom line, there has been an outright bias against certain ideas. And that's not even projection, because, I mean, the people watching straight up do it. But there's projection in terms of the audience, like with The Dark Knight Rises, The Dark Knight, and Ghostbusters. They watched some media and put their own views on it that weren't necessarily made by the author. But then with Squid Games and Bones, we can point out that, yes, the person writing this straight up had a political argument, and they made this fictional story that illustrates how clearly they are right and anyone who disagrees is wrong. So with politics, be wary of projection, whether you're interpreting something or if you're making something. And this season, I'm going to do an episode about art. And there I talk about intention versus, I guess, pure creativity. Okay, so tribalism. Now, this one's a little tricky because technically this whole episode and the previous could be considered talking about tribalism. So I'm going to try and keep this a little succinct. So an issue that I noticed is, imagine that there's 20 political issues, and these 20 political issues are nicely have two sides or two different stances on them, each going in a different direction. And let's say I'm an American, so I'll just use American vernacular. The Republican and Democrat parties each have a different stance on all of these 20 issues. Now, if an individual agreed with the Democrat stance on all 20 of them, I think we can say that they're Democrat, or that's the party they agree with. Now, let's say someone has 19 issues that they side with the Republican Party on, and one that they agree with the Democrats on. Again, we can probably say, yeah, they're a Republican. They just have a nuanced opinion on one issue. So my question is, what happens if there isn't a overwhelming push to one side? And the reason I say this is because I've noticed over time, people who have been around for decades and they say, I've been this political party my whole life. They don't even say I've been a part of the political party. They say, I'm a Democrat, or I'm a Republican. I've been a Republican my whole life, or something like that. It's literally like as if if it was an identity thing. And so that may be influenced by the issues I've talked about, their temperament and whatnot. But in another sense, it's much more superficial, the designation they're giving themselves, but it's a very big part of their identity. And identity is a big thing. It goes along with everything else that I've talked about. And so when we're talking about people belonging to something, that's another factor. That's what I mean by tribalism, is that they will cling to the tribe because of the tribe, not necessarily because they've thought everything else out. And I say this because I mentioned people who have been a member of a party for decades, because things change. And just because a party had a stance on something doesn't mean that that's what they're doing in this day and age. And just because they claimed to stand for that doesn't mean they actually did it. I've noticed a lot of disaffected people these days who used to be a part of a party. And because a candidate is running under the banner of a party doesn't mean they're going to toe the party line. And in some cases, that's a good thing. And then in other cases, maybe not so much. So another aspect of tribalism is with politics, a lot of people like to shake their finger with this moral high ground. And you're bad, we're good, that kind of thing. And anytime there's a action that could be considered despicable or whatnot, they point their finger and say, you are doing that bad, despicable thing. Or maybe it's not that bad, not that severe. It's something a bit more honest, like, oh, that's not a good look. Maybe you shouldn't do it. But again, when it comes to tribalism, I've seen a lot of people do a lot of finger pointing at others when they do things. And then whenever a person of their party does that same reprehensible thing, it's somehow okay. Like they weren't being malicious. They were, you misunderstood what they were saying, that kind of thing. Or, and in some cases, it even goes so far as, well, it's okay when we do it, basically. And so that's something that I've been struggling with. If something is truly bad in a vacuum, then no one should be doing it, even if it is a benefit to your tribe. And an example I've seen is that people are accused of wrongdoing all the time or having a conflict of interest when it comes to a politician being involved in some committee or hearing, that kind of thing. But again, whenever it's beneficial for their party and there's a conflict of interest, people are okay with, like, no, they're not biased. It's impossible to find someone completely unbiased. And this person, while they have their leanings, they are a just person, so they will behave well. So with tribalism, there's a lot of blind eyes that are turned. And so that's something to be aware of. So check yourself. And this is just life in general, but an idea that I heard is be wary of your fantasies. Now, let me prime this one a little bit. In video games, there's been lots of talk about how violent video games make people violent. They desensitize you, that kind of thing. And I've heard stories for and against that argument. And we're talking about video games where you shoot or stab or hack up people, basically. People more specifically than monsters, because that's the dehumanizing aspect. So people say that's bad because you're killing people in this fake environment, and that's going to, whether or not it spills over into your life, it's not a good thing. And I heard someone joke with video games about how, well, okay, is it okay to shoot anyone? Because monsters, people are like, well, it's still violence, but I mean, it's monsters or aliens, that kind of thing. And so people put forth, all right, if it's okay to shoot them, is it okay to shoot anyone else? And someone answered, Nazis and zombies. The Wolfenstein series is where you're fighting Nazis, and zombies, well, they're everywhere. And in the Call of Duty games, there's a zombie Nazi mode where you shoot zombie Nazis. And the argument is that it's okay to shoot a zombie because even though they were a person, they're not alive anymore and they're trying to eat your brains. And Nazis, it's okay to shoot them because they're a bad person. So now going forward with that, I've seen lots of people justify very bad things against people with differing political views because that person was, insert label here, something bad, generally speaking. Now, whether or not they actually were that bad thing, that's a different subject. And oftentimes, in my experience, no, they're not. That's that label that's being attached to them is being used as justification for vitriol, amongst other things. So, in terms of checking yourself, be wary of your views on other people and exactly what you're labeling them as, and just be honest with yourself about your own feelings. And I've heard some people say that they're all about love and kindness and they want peace. And when things are going great, they seem like lovely people. But when things don't quite go their way, you can see it doesn't take much for the claws to come out. And it's not that I'm against love and kindness, and peace is a good thing, but uh, with individuals like that, we're all human. We all do experience those things. And again, there's lots of signs that I can see that, yes, this kind and loving person, kind of the opposite of the zombie Nazis, they've granted themselves a label that puts them above bad things, basically. And so they're not looking at what they're really doing and seeing how, yeah, they do possibly have violent impulses. They do possibly have hateful views of other people. So that's something, again, we got to check ourselves. And I've had friends from all parts of the political spectrum, and we agree that as Americans, we are over medicated and we should be more natural and holistic in terms of healthcare. But when election season comes around, everyone from all these different political views say, my candidate or political party will make prescription drugs more affordable and available because that's the party line. That's the selling point for the party vote, is that they're going to make things better. And one of the ways to do that is to make prescription drugs more affordable and available for the people that need them. And so a lot of these otherwise intelligent people don't see how quickly they can flip their views on something if it advances their political leanings. And a lot of these people, they don't spend every second of every day talking about this kind of thing, but when it does come out, they are pretty fervent about how their party or way is right. And yeah, there's lots of levels of how forceful they argue with that. But again, it's with the 2020 election year, it has been truly impressive with how many people from, again, all over the political spectrum can so readily flip an argument that they were making or turn away from a view they previously had because doing so would be to the benefit of their political party. So, again, wrapping this point up is check yourself, beware of your fantasies, beware of what you think about yourself, and pay attention to why you are arguing for certain things. Okay, so interacting with others. So I mentioned this at the end of the last podcast, which is that we want to create models to explain certain things, or diagrams, let's say. And there's times when they're pretty accurate. We have mapped certain behavior or phenomena, but we don't fully understand everything about nature, the universe, or whatnot. And so as a result, those models will fail us from time to time. So with the models I mentioned earlier and anything I discussed here, don't use it as a cudgel. It's something to bear in mind. And with interacting with others, everyone talks about divide happening right now and political discourse falling apart. So if we want to improve anything, we're going to have to be brave and just talk with someone who disagrees, specifically about what we disagree on. And I've said this quote before, but there's this woman named Cassie J who said, "If you seek to understand, you will never be offended." And so with political discourse, I don't think that's a great quote, but I don't think it quite holds up because understanding someone's views, that's not where the danger comes from. The danger comes from if you understand their views, you find out that they are right and you are wrong. That's where the fear comes in. It's like the jiu-jitsu guy. When faced with the notion that your life has been a lie or has been wrong, that's the bitter pill to swallow. And I think that's what people from time to time are afraid of. That this person disagrees with me on such a deep level, it's almost repulsive, but yet I find that they might be right. So again, if you seek to understand, you won't be offended, but you may get scared. So be brave. And of course, don't stop at one person. I've seen so many political pundits basically talk about, well, we talk with someone who disagrees and they get the dumbest, most uneducated person who's not very articulate, try and explain their views, and they look like an idiot. And let's be honest, that was kind of intentional. There's lots of people that I don't disagree with. I'm sorry. There's lots of people that I disagree with politically and just in terms of worldview, but I have to hand it to them that there are some who, while I disagree with them, make a strong point. And when you're talking with someone, like, don't expect necessarily to save the world or we're all going to be one big happy family. That stuff's great, but don't go in there with that expectation, or don't go with the expectation that I'm going to change that person. Go to listen. If they're not in that to listen, or they're not in there to have honest discourse, then yeah, maybe it's time to move on. And even if nobody changes anyone else's mind, hey, if you're debating politics or whatnot, understanding their argument makes you better prepared to argue for yours. It gives you the chance to see potential flaws and refine your view. So you can't deny the tactical value of that. Okay, so to wrap up this entire topic, let's say, I got a little story. So someone told me about how they grew up in a cul-de-sac area in suburbia, and since it was a cul-de-sac, all these houses were pretty close together. They would occasionally have these neighborhood get-together things, and everyone would come over to one place or that kind of thing, and they would talk, and like all the parents knew the adults knew each other, and if they had kids, the kids knew each other. The adults, even if they weren't their own kids, knew who the kids were and would, be protective, that kind of thing. And this guy, let's call him Bob. I don't actually remember his name. So Bob grew up in that cul-de-sac area, and he knew Mr. Smith. Let's call him that. So Bob, growing up, knew Mr. Smith. He was a nice guy, decent fellow, and they had various interactions from time to time where Mr. Smith clearly, even though Bob was not his son or a blood relative, cared about the well-being. Mr. Smith cared about Bob's well-being. So fast forward, Bob grows up, goes to college, leaves the cul-de-sac for a while, gets involved with, online politics kind of thing. And then on social media, I'm not going to name anyone, Bob at one point had friended or followed, whatever you want to call it, Mr. Smith. Now, during a particularly hot political year, Bob saw that Mr. Smith disagreed politically with him. Mr. Smith posted something, and Bob was immediately repulsed by Mr. Smith. And he was about to unfriend or follow him, but he made a realization, which is that Bob had a bunch of friends or people on social media that he let into his life. He shared his information with them. He saw their information, whether it's just random posts or whatnot, because of their political leanings. But he had not met most of those people. So he admired people online because they agreed with him politically. But here, Mr. Smith, he was willing to cut him off from that digital life solely because he disagreed with his political views. And again, he grew up with Mr. Smith. He knew that Mr. Smith was a decent person, and he knew that Mr. Smith in some way cared about his well-being. But he was ready to axe that just because that Mr. Smith expressed a differing political view. So that's a story that really sobers things up. And yes, I've been in situations where there are people that I know and I viewed them as a lost cause and I wrote them out because of political ideas. So I'm not saying we have to be best friends with every single person. I'm just saying remember that story and don't get caught up on the ideas, at least not until you fully acknowledge the person, the individual. So, politics, it's a mess. But hopefully we can talk things out and find common ground. And I do see that for the most part, people agree more than we give ourselves credit for. And that's an encouraging thought. So thank you again for listening to this episode. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate it. And now it's time for a little bit of housekeeping. Take care, everybody. Okay, everybody. Normally, this is the part of my podcast where I would do housekeeping and tell you how to follow my channel and that kind of thing. But since recording this episode in October of last year, I've stumbled upon some things that I want to keep talking about. So, this was the second episode about political alignment. Originally, when I was making outlines, there was going to be a third episode. And basically, I was going to gather data on certain policies advocated by politics that people have strong emotions about, tying this into the previous episode. And I wanted to show the intentions of the policies, why people so strongly push for these things. And then I wanted to show the results. And because I saw a lot of cases where an intended policy wasn't doing what was expected, and then how people reacted. And of course, tying this back to the emotional attachment to the ideas behind the policies that I've been covering these past two episodes. And I wanted to show also some metrics on, I wanted to show how certain groups of people think about themselves and others in return in terms of intelligence and compassion. And then I also had some data on kind of intelligence. That's a tricky one, but also who does more acts that could be considered compassionate, because it's not clear and cut. And there's a bunch of other stuff that I wanted to shine a light on with the actual consequences of how we act out things. And again, these were mostly about political things, but they stem from ideas. So that was a big part of it too. I chose not to do this third episode where I kind of try and see the actual results of all this, because remember what I added on the end of the previous episode, how people read a synopsis of Dr. Haidt's book and how they couldn't see how his pillars, or if someone would rank strongly in one of his pillars, how that could lead someone to morally disagree on certain policies. And I remember how I said with this episode, how people saw a study that observed a phenomena and people said, oh, this is why those people are stupid or have bad ideas, basically like that. So I didn't do a third episode about the observable effects of policies and behaviors because I saw that it was already being used to point fingers and justify division. It's like, oh, this is why those people are so, that kind of thing. And when I was planning that episode, it wasn't for the purpose of proving one viewpoint correct, even though in my life I do have my views, of course, and they're, substantiated by what I've seen. I wanted to shine a light on how reality and theory don't usually line up with worldviews, because particularly, I think Dr. Haidt said something about how morality, brings us together and it can make us stronger in a way when we fight against something, but it also blinds us to objectivity. And so objectivity is a tricky thing because, as I mentioned with Dr. McGilchrist's book and just everything in these, or specifically the first episode about political alignment, is that we're influenced by a lot of things. And so there's the classic philosophical notion, are humans capable of objectively viewing the world? And personally, I think not. So, yeah, third episode, I knew it would be used in bad faith, just like how I talked about this episode with the conservative and liberal news outlets that found some study that shined their opposition in a negative light, and how that was used for, proof that we're right and they're wrong. Honestly, nobody has all the answers. And even if I've seen a lot of quote unquote good people do some very nasty things. And so I'll keep elaborating on that. And so with my previous episode, I got some feedback from people about it. And first of all, thank you if you did so. And there was a common theme amongst all what people were telling me, which is that I've heard someone say people assume the worst about others, or people can't peacefully disagree anymore, or people are just going to their echo chambers and alienating each other. And I agreed entirely. And I almost posed the question back to them, do you reach across the political aisle? Okay, do you listen to someone who disagrees with you and try to understand? But I thought I didn't say that to anyone because I thought it would make me sound like a jerk. And I'm not perfect in that regard either. I'm working on it. And I admit, though, it is hard to even have a simple discussion about this when it comes to reaching across the aisle. I see content creators on YouTube and such, and oftentimes most of them fully admit that they have a political slant, although others pose themselves as being unbiased. But some people, most of them, again, are only in their little echo chambers, spitting out information that affirms what they believe, and oftentimes ignoring information that is in conflict with it. But there are people that say, okay, we're going to have a discussion with someone with differing views. And a kind of one that seems to be growing in popularity is called Jubilee. And they kind of brand themselves as an unbiased organization, and they're just promoting discussions on issues, trying to bridge the gap kind of thing. And they'll pick an issue and grab a bunch of people who land on either side of it. They'll pose a question in that topic, and then people who agree give their pitch on why they agree with it, and then discussion ensues. I've noticed, however, that often with one group, they don't pick people who are the best spokesman for that position, and these are on positions that I have familiarity with, and I look at it and say, you shouldn't have worded it that way, or you're missing this argument, that kind of thing. And with another group, they get people who are, at the very least, louder at expressing themselves. And I mentioned that because in my first season, I did an episode about debate versus argument and how a person can seemingly win an argument even though they had no factual basis to do so, simply because they were more charismatic, or they could, kind of confund other people by being loud, kind of. Okay. And I noticed with Jubilee how it seems like one side, they don't get the best representatives, and others, at least, they're slightly better at articulating. This consistently seems to fall on ideological lines. And again, I'm familiar with a lot of these issues, and I know that, yeah, on one side, they didn't bring out the best, and the others, they definitely got people that were talented verbally. Let's put it that way. And there are other shows that say, we lean this way politically, but we are open to discussions. And there are some good discussions on there, but there are a lot of people who offer to have a discussion that aren't reaching out in good faith. It's an ambush environment. And when they're confronted about that, about how they seemingly bullied someone, or they didn't let them speak, or they were not it wasn't a good conversation, their response often is, well, maybe you're not as smart as you think you are, or that position isn't as good, or it's indefensible. Maybe that's just proof about how we're right and they're wrong. And so in season 1, that episode I did about debate versus argument, I also talked about how there's this thing called a conversation, and where people can be interested in learning or understanding. But so many would-be conversations, when it comes to politics, like I said in this episode, it's very tribal. And so it's not just a conversation between two people, and it's not just about trying to understand. An individual becomes an avatar for their idea in a much larger battleground. And that's not a good stage for trying to understand someone. So with all of this, I've heard a lot of people talk about how we're so divided, and, people don't understand each other, or they're not making an effort to, or they're assuming the worst, that kind of thing. And I always try, when I point out a problem, I always try and give what I think is a solution. And so I got 2 stories to tell you real quick, and it's kind of a bit of both. I don't have a great solution, but here we go. So in 2019, there were 2 group events, let's say, that I went to that had a big effect on me. The first one was in January on Martin Luther King Day. Where I live, there is a big march. I'm told it's one of the biggest in the country for Martin Luther King Day. And I'd never gone before. And so in 2019, I had that day off, and I'm like, you know what? I think I'll go. Let's check this out. And when I got there, well, before I got there, I kind of had this idealistic view of, it's MLK Day. People are posting quotes on social media about love and kindness and acceptance. And I guess I wanted to see just a little bit of that there at this march. But as soon as I got there with, a large group of people, I noticed that there were various interest groups for certain political stances, ideological stances, that kind of thing. Or like, we're just promoting a cause that happens to fall on a certain ideological line. And they would have posters and whatnot, and they would have Martin Luther King quotes on them. And it was basically, with some of them, Martin Luther King is a good person who preached love and healing and that kind of thing, and was a big historical figure. And he said this, and they quoted that basically. And this was basically his statement gives substance to our political view or ideological view. Basically, he proves us right. And on occasion, there were two differing ideological groups or special causes, whatever you want to call them, that used the same quote. And it was basically his words basically prove that we are right and we need to continue the fight in our whatever we're doing. And I got disheartened almost immediately. And I wanted out, but I had taken a shuttle to the march location, so I had to get to the end to get back to my car. So, and here's the thing. There were causes in that crowd that I agreed with, that lined up with my worldview. I thought it was important. I had my reasons, yada, yada, yada. But I didn't want to see it at this march. What did I want to see? That brings me to story number 2. But I'll say that experience kind of like, I don't think I'm going to any Martin Luther King Day march anytime soon based off of that. So another experience that I had was in 2019, there's this, I guess, organization or event. I guess it's kind of both, called Wreaths Across America, like Christmas wreaths. And basically they purchase a bunch of Christmas wreaths and they get volunteers to help put them on the tombstones and memorials of various service members all across, in military cemeteries all across America. And I have families members that are in the military. It's important to me, and so I got the opportunity to volunteer at that to help with. We don't know what they're going to do because it's just volunteer. So I signed up, and I didn't have any expectations of it other than this is something that I care about, and let's do it. So when I got there, there was a bunch of other people. We got instructions from the military about what we're going to do. It was basically, there was a huge shipping truck full of boxes loaded with wreaths, and we were going to unpack them and help them organize them, that kind of thing. And we weren't getting great instructions. It was a little chaotic, but we figured things out quickly, and we found a way to make like an assembly line efficiency of doing this, because after unloading, there were a couple of other steps we had to do. And overall, it was just a good atmosphere. We were all very different people of varying ages, different skin colors, men, women, everything in between. I'm sure there were different sexual orientations in that group, but it didn't matter because there was lots of just friendly camaraderie that was struck up, and we had lots of lovely conversations and laughs and that kind of thing. We weren't saving lives and we weren't changing the world, but we were all working together towards something that we cared about. And so I had that experience had a big impact on me. And so I've talked about, when I talked about MLK Day, the march, what did I expect to see there or hope to see there? Something a bit more like what I saw at the Wreaths Across America. And it wasn't necessarily, I don't see how it was political. I mean, I know some people who would categorize it as that, but that's a tiny portion of the population. So I've heard people talking about we need to, unify or become more united, or we need to heal the divide. So what's my solution? I don't know, because I don't think just telling everyone to go do reviews across America is it. But my challenge would be, I guess, when you see people doing something you really don't like, whether it's something they say, post on social media, or actions that they don't do, make ridiculing others, that kind of thing, first, take a look at what you've thought, felt, and done, and see if you've ever behaved similarly, particularly with the thoughts that you've had or entertained. This is something that I try to do because I keep hearing people say about bridging the divide. We have more in common than we all think. And I think we do. We agree on a lot more than we give ourselves credit for. But in terms of what we have in common, and when we see other people do bad things or be rude or ridicule others, yeah, that's included in some of the things that we have in common. I've found people that I disagree with politically, and I've seen them do nasty things and say nasty things, and I thought, oh, I can't stand that. But then I've seen people that I agree with politically doing the same things, and just because I agree with them, and I think that their worldview is right, it doesn't absolve them of the childishness or the rudeness or the belittling that they do, that we accused others of being bad people for doing. Okay. And I've said this before, sooner or later, everyone is a hypocrite. That includes you. And another quote I've said before is, if you seek to understand, you'll never be offended. So take those quotes with you whenever you want to look at other people that disagree with you and think, why? Or if you want to bridge that gap. The key word is understand. But again, understand, that's not the same thing as, oh, this is why those people have such a stupid viewpoint. They can't help it. Okay, that was heavy. Thank you guys for listening. If you want to support this podcast, please leave a review wherever you found it on Apple, Google, or Spotify podcast. And if you have anything you want to add or concerns or whatnot, or just let me know what you thought about anything in this episode, reach out to me on social media. I'm on most of them. And yeah, thank you, everybody, and take care. Hope to see you next week. Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening. So that 17 minutes that you just heard was added onto the original release because there was a delay between recording and releasing, and I noticed more things and had to add them. And I didn't have a great way of adding on that addition to the first thing and this new housekeeping that we have here. So I kind of just stuck this on the end. I'm sorry about that. I know it's clunky and confusing, but those 17 minutes were really important. But that was the last one for this season. Everything else out. It's going to be better. Apologize again for that, and I'm sorry for the confusion. So I sound like a broken record, but since this episode aired, I've seen a lot more of the same, politically speaking, and that's a bit disheartening. And my views are somewhat unchanged about how to reach across the aisle, if you will. But yeah, it starts with the individual. That's something that I fully believe. And this topic is something that I most eagerly want to hear feedback on, especially if you disagree with me. So please let me know in the comments. If you want to support this channel, please like the video or subscribe to my channel. That's the best way. Or share this episode with someone you think needs to hear it, because ultimately that's my goal, is to get people having real conversations, I guess you could say. So thank you again for listening. Next week, we're going to start talking about art and what is it and how important is it in our society. Thanks again for listening, everybody. Take care.